First, we should review the most important points we made about Romanticism. We started our Romanticism topic with the standard common understanding of the word romantic today as being about love and individuals expressing their feelings and desires. We expanded that quite dramatically by looking at how romantic traditions went back as far as medieval times and took in a whole culture of noble love, knights going on quests, monsters, chivalry, and customs regulating relations between men and women. This tradition had become thoroughly old-fashioned by the early 17th century, since European society had much changed. In the 18th century, the time of Enlightenment, the term romantic gradually came to be again used in a more favourable way through people recognising landscapes as being of aesthetic value. Romantic could then mean the natural landscape of the old country, or simply the untouched natural wilderness. Since the cities were the newly developing places that people had changed and had in turn changed people, not always for the better. We looked briefly at two key terms, the beautiful and the sublime. One meant the attractively ordered, regular, composed, pleasing arrangement, and then the sublime suggested the experience of the infinite, strange, alluring depths of nature. The ways in which these experiences of nature were valuable stimulated much discussion. Then we underlined a key romantic attitude, that the appreciation of nature was part of an appreciation of the emotions, the inner life of the mind, and the imagination, more than anything. Romantics hoped that individuals could appreciate artistic expression and the experiences of the natural in ways that would stimulate their emotions, drawing them closer to the world, as if emotional sincerity might forge a connection with the natural world that artificial cities were leaving behind. Remember these general points about Romanticism and romantic experience. Nature, emotions, the individual, sincerity, art, and the imagination, because they will be useful for understanding the Rousseau text Fifth Walk that you read across these 2 weeks, and we will develop them further. It's also important to recall that Romanticism's cultural high point of influence came probably in the early 1800s, but Rousseau was writing well before that. His writings such as Fifth Walk are considered early examples and influences on the emergence of Romanticism. And so we should recognise that Rousseau was not thinking to himself, I'm a romantic and trying to write like them. Rousseau is something like a grandfather figure for Romanticism, proper, that develops after, in fact, he dies. Did Romanticism emerge as a very popular movement across Europe just because of appreciating landscapes and emotions? No. It's more complicated, and we generally think of Romanticism as a general movement of rebellion in different ways against tradition as part of the Enlightenment, but also demanding a far better appreciation of what individuals needed as individual beings with their own particular emotional and private lives. We can say that Romanticism gave particular impetus to an emerging modern culture of private existence, which now feels completely normal to us and which has increasingly allowed us to think of our lives as ours to fulfill in our own ways. The Enlightenment, with its concern for reason, progress, and public life, had less concern for emotional fulfillment or for representing types of human experience that went beyond the standard rules of tasteful and polite art. Some romantics were interested in the powerful experiences of what we now call the Gothic. Moody and dark landscapes or ruins of earlier times that evoked far more the sublime than the beautiful. Appreciating the Gothic formed part of some romantics' desires to recall when life was less rationally ordered, when darker, more primal forces were at work, or at least to affirm a culture that appreciated more than just progress and technical reason. If we realise that Gothic refers originally to the 12th century, then we can also see that some of this romantic perspective, looking back, connects with the appreciation of a nature that still included the supernatural or the darker side of the spiritual. The rebellious attitude here is against modern progress, making so much of our surroundings artificial, neat and well ordered. Some of the romantics thought that must be deeper experiences that we were gradually repressing in modern life. We can see that Romanticism was a quite complicated cultural movement, and in reacting to the Enlightenment, they sought different types of experiences. Now, what were some of the problems with the Enlightenment that turned people towards such rebellion? We can answer that to some extent if we now turn to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and read how his influential views suggested to many that they should doubt the mainstream progress beginning in cities. You can start with something he wrote in the 1750s, his second discourse, as we now call it. A short excerpt is in the unit reader after Fifth Walk. The full title, Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Amongst Men, tells us its real focus, the issue of inequalities between people. This second discourse was written in answer to an essay competition set by an academy, and such essay competitions were common and provoked public debate, much as we saw with Kant's essay answering the question, "What is enlightenment?" published in a newspaper. Rousseau had previously won the competition set by the same academy with an essay that was amongst the first criticisms of the Enlightenment, published in 1750. The second discourse did not win the competition again in 1755, but was far more influential, continuing Rousseau's doubts about progress and raising further questions about the way society was changing. It is still taught around the world to undergraduate students as one of the very first modern explanations of human society's foundations. And that's because it tried to explain using history, in fact in a way far advanced of Adam Smith's short history of commerce we saw previously. The ideas I want to focus on helps you to understand why Rousseau could feel later, when describing his happiness in Fifth Walk, that being apart from mainstream human society for a while could be a really good experience. In the first place, Rousseau felt that human society had developed because we had gradually come to depend on each other and had lost a basic sense of self-sufficiency that was quite natural in us long ago. Once this had happened, dependency became more common and some gradually became stronger and dominated. The clearest sign of this for Rousseau was the emergence of property. Owning land and then owning tools and then huts and later buildings meant that some people controlled much more than others and could demand others work for them. Some in society then depended on others to provide shelter or work or access to tools and materials. The inequalities of property differences also supported other types of inequalities, as people in larger and larger societies competed for power, prestige, or fame. People compared what each had in new ways and started to also reward or influence or present themselves as more successful to others. Making comparisons between people leads to seeing ourselves in distorted ways, argued Rousseau. He sees the people of Enlightenment Europe in his day, after a long history of rising inequality, as trapped in the intricate games of social comparison. What have you got? Am I doing well? Should I have more? Will I have prestige, honour or fame? For all the advancement of Europe, Rousseau thought societies were very much about competitive and comparative values. People saw themselves, Rousseau thought, with the values society promoted, wealth, power, class distinctions, as all important. I would then be thinking of myself often through the eyes of the other, concerned about how well I appear. I then do not see myself as I really am very well, since my perspective is distorted by these values coming from my experience of others and the way they interact with me. appearance and prestige rules over genuine self-worth. We would probably just use the word vanity to describe what Rousseau thought had become dominant in the Enlightenment. That is still a very interesting psychological observation and one we can still wonder about today. We had increasingly lost, he thought, the capacity for basic self-sufficiency and a healthy care of the self, the attitude towards ourself that we could have if we were not so saturated with the values of so-called advanced society. In some ways, Rousseau had been influenced by new awareness of different human groups across the globe. That less civilized, more primitive peoples Europeans were coming into contact with more and more seemed to be healthier, more vigorous, closer to nature, and less cluttered with complex rules of morality, suggested that European Enlightenment was not the self-evident advance that some imagined. The American Indians, Pacific Islanders, and some of the tribal groups across North Africa showed the Europeans that there were different and very successful ways to live. Of course, Europeans went out, stole lands, built colonies, and sometimes enslaved non-European peoples. But for some thinkers like Rousseau, this only showed how cruel and dominating European society had become. So, Rousseau had a rather critical view of his own society, the aristocratic world of France, which was considered amongst the most civilized, the most advanced and progressive. If we look at the key ideas from the second discourse and then other short excerpts, then we can start to see why the older Rousseau's last text, Fifth Walk, our main reading on this topic, is about a retreat into nature, the valuing of a quiet life with just a few others, and Rousseau valuing basic activities quite apart from city life. We should also see that Rousseau is not just an early romantic with ideas about his personal life feeling better, because he had these important political and we might say moral criticisms of his society in general. Rousseau also had written important other political works and argued in favour of a far more democratic society. He had also written a long book on education, describing how letting children experience nature from early in life was a good thing. Nature is also a type of teacher for Rousseau, since we have come from it but travelled away from it across history, creating more and more artificial worlds. We might be better off to return and to be closer to it, or at least begin to raise future generations closer to its fundamental powers and effects. These are important first points about Rousseau, and the short reading after Fifth Walk can be read in a few minutes before you start it. The next lecture starts on the Fifth Walk text and how it is set up by Rousseau. Thank you.